Nurse Nightingale's reject. That's what Dr. Pierce called her in the attending lounge, his voice dripping with the kind of contempt reserved for people he'd already decided were beneath him. Katie Rodriguez didn't flinch when she overheard it at the vending machine on the 3rd floor. She didn't turn around. She just selected her coffee with the same steady hands that had once performed field surgery under mortar fire, pressing the button with the precision of someone who understood that composure was a weapon sharper than any blade. The fluorescent lights hummed above her like angry insects as she waited for the cup to drop. That was the moment Dr. Pierce appeared behind her, his expensive shoes clicking against the tile floor with the rhythm of someone who'd never learned to walk quietly. He suggested, his voice casual and poisoned, that security might need to escort her out if she kept practicing medicine without a license. Katie took her coffee. She walked past him without a word, her jaw clenching once, briefly, a muscle spasm she controlled before it could become visible. The supply closet was 3 hallways away. Once inside, surrounded by rolls of gauze and bottles of saline solution, she gripped the metal shelf until her knuckles went white. The shelf was cold. Real. Something solid to hold onto when everything else felt like it was dissolving. She breathed. In. Out. In. Out. The trembling in her left hand, shrapnel damage from Helmand Province, 8 months old, maybe 9, only showed when she was alone. Only when no one was watching. Nobody at Seattle General knew the truth about Katie Rodriguez. Not the HR department that had processed her nursing credentials. Not the infection control committee that questioned her documentation protocols. Not even the other ICU nurses who smiled at her with the tired sympathy reserved for hospital pariahs. They saw a new nurse. A careful one. Meticulous to the point of obsession about vital signs, about noticing the smallest changes in a patient's condition, about catching things that somehow everyone else missed. What they didn't know was that Captain Katie Rodriguez, 23 years old when she deployed to Helmand Province with the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company, had learned to read a human body the way most people read a clock. She'd learned it in a mud brick compound outside San Jin Valley, performing thoracotomies by flashlight while mortar rounds fell like rain. She'd learned it in the dirt, under enemy fire, holding lives together with hands that shook from adrenaline and fear and the terrible knowledge that if she made one wrong cut, one wrong stitch, someone's mother wouldn't get to see them again. The shrapnel that had taken a chunk out of her left shoulder had also taken her out of active service. It had taken her out of Helmand Province. It had taken her out of the life she'd spent 8 years building inside military compounds and forward operating bases. And then a man in a Pentagon office had called and offered her something different. A new name. A new identity. A nursing credential that would hold up under every background check. A mission, monitor Colonel Marcus Webb's recovery at Seattle General and identify who was selling classified medical information about wounded special operations personnel to foreign intelligence agencies. Nobody at Seattle General knew any of that. They just knew she was careful. And they definitely didn't know she was the best trauma surgeon they'd ever have working 12-hour shifts in the ICU at minimum wage. Katie pushed open the door to room for 47 at 06 for 7 hours. The numbers on the clock were the first thing she always noticed, timestamps, vital sign trends, the gaps between breaths that meant infection was winning. Colonel Marcus Webb lay in the hospital bed like a photograph of something broken. Pale skin. Swollen lymph nodes at the left side of his jaw. The antibiotic-resistant infection had been growing for 6 days before any of the attending physicians noticed it. Katie had noticed it on day 3. She documented the fever curve, the subtle shift in his mental status, the way his left foot had started to swell. She'd flagged it in her notes using 3 separate protocol violations because none of the official channels had trained her to write fast enough to catch something this dangerous moving this fast. The chart in her hands was thick with alerts and warnings, a symphony of red flags that someone should have been reading days ago. But Colonel Webb was a Green Beret. A unit medic himself, 47 years old now, with shrapnel scars across his left side and hands that had held lives together in the same mud brick compounds where Katie had learned her craft. She recognized the unit patch sewn into the jacket hanging on the chair beside his bed. Faded olive drab, the stitching coming loose at one corner. Same unit. Different years. Different war. Or maybe the same war, just different chapters of it. His eyes opened when she checked the 4-line, tracking her movements with the clarity that came from military training and the fog that came from infection and fever. Recognition flickered across his face for just a moment, not of her specifically, but of something familiar. The way a combat medic recognizes another combat medic. The particular attention to detail. The absence of wasted motion. The knowledge in her fingertips when she checked for skin turgor and capillary refill. He tried to speak, his voice rough. Infection spreading to the lungs. She could hear it in the texture of his breathing, the way the ventilator struggled against his own respiratory effort. Katie adjusted the 4 rate with the movements of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Not 1,000 times in a hospital. 1,000 times in places with different walls, different equipment, different kinds of danger. The saline solution ran clear, the foresight clean, no signs of phlebitis yet. She documented everything in his chart with the precision that had gotten her called Nurse Nightingale's reject by Dr. Pierce. The phrase didn't sting the way he intended it to. She'd learned long ago that insults from people like Dr. Pierce were just noise. Just the sound of someone exercising the only power he had over someone he couldn't understand. He saw a new nurse. A competent one. Thorough to the point of being obsessive. Careful with documentation. Attentive to small changes. He didn't see the captain who'd held the femoral artery of a 22-year-old Marine closed with her bare fingers while another medic found the hemorrhage control tourniquet. He didn't see the hands that had performed 11 consecutive field thoracotomies under direct enemy fire, using a combat knife when the surgical instruments were buried under debris from an IED strike. He didn't see the eyes that could read the trajectory of an infection and predict its destination 3 days before the blood cultures came back positive. He just saw someone who violated protocols in ways that made him uncomfortable because those protocol violations meant his patients were still alive when he arrived to take credit for it. The heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm. Sinus rhythm. 84 beats per minute. Still holding. Still fighting. Katie made a note to check his core temperature again in 2 hours. The fever pattern was escalating. Non-linear. The kind of infection that didn't read the textbooks. The kind that required someone to notice it before it became somebody's last day alive. She was still making notes in the chart when Dr. Pierce entered the room at 0703 hours. His presence changed the air pressure. Not through any supernatural force. Just through the simple physics of ego and white coat and the absolute certainty that he owned this space, these patients, this hierarchy of competence that placed him at the top and everyone else somewhere below. His shoes clicked against the linoleum. Expensive. Italian. The kind of shoes that cost as much as Katie's entire month's salary. He picked up Colonel Webb's chart without acknowledging her presence, scanning her documentation with the expression of someone reading a menu at a restaurant they'd already decided was beneath them. Katie stepped back from the bedside. Not far. Just enough to make space for him while remaining close enough to monitor the patient. The subtle dance of hospital hierarchy. The young nurse making room for the attending physician. The competent person stepping aside for the important one. Dr. Pierce frowned at her notes. His jaw tightened. She'd documented something he'd missed. Again. His eyes moved to her, and in that moment, Katie understood the calculus that was running through his mind. This nurse made him look bad. Not through arrogance. Not through any overt challenge to his authority. Just through the simple act of being right when he'd been wrong. Through noticing things he hadn't noticed. Through caring about details he'd skipped over because details were what junior staff did. Important men made big-picture decisions. This nurse was going to become a problem. Katie could see it forming behind his eyes like a storm front. The decision to turn her into one. Dr. Pierce held the patient chart above his head like a prosecution exhibit, his voice filling the Grand Rounds conference room with theatrical precision. 12 residents and 4 attendings watched from their tiered seats, coffee cups pausing midway to mouths. Our newest nurse, he announced, each word clipped and deliberate, has documented vitals in a manner that violates 3 different hospital protocols. He turned the chart toward the assembled physicians, tapping it with his pen. This is what happens when nursing schools lower their standards. Katie stood against the back wall, her hands folded in front of her scrubs. Her jaw clenched once, briefly, a single muscle twitch that would have been invisible to anyone not trained to read the smallest tells of pain. Her face remained perfectly neutral, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. She didn't blink. She didn't look away. She simply stood there, receiving the public dissection the way a sentry receives the rain. I've started calling her Nurse Nightingale's reject in the lounge, Pierce continued, and scattered uncomfortable laughter rippled through the residence like wind across still water. Seems fitting for someone who thinks she knows better than physicians. He turned his body toward the audience, playing to it now, performing. This wasn't medicine anymore. This was theater, and he was the star. Katie's hand stayed steady at her sides. No trembling. No flush creeping up her neck. Just the clinical observation of her own survival, the same detachment she'd learned performing field triage under mortar fire in the Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province, where decisions had to be made in seconds and emotion was a liability you couldn't afford. She watched Pierce's face for tells, the slight flush of satisfaction, the way his pupils dilated when the laughter came. He was getting something from this. Dopamine, probably. The intoxication of unchallenged power. The grand rounds continued around her. She heard nothing of it. Her mind was cataloguing the exits, the positioning of the residents, the fact that Dr. Marchand from cardiology looked uncomfortable, which meant he might be an ally if things escalated. Information. Always information. Always the next move. By 1400 hours, she was in the break room pretending to check her phone when 2 physicians drifted toward the vending machine, their voices low but not low enough. "Did you hear Pierce's new nickname for the new nurse?" one of them said. "Nightingale's reject." They laughed, genuine laughter, the kind that bonds people through shared cruelty. Katie stood with her back to them, scrolling through a blank screen, her breathing even. In, out. In, out. Like a metronome. Like the ventilator in Webb's room keeping him alive. She stood when they left and made her selection, black coffee, no sugar. Her fingers entered the numbers with the same methodical precision she'd used to thread sutures through human tissue in compounds that were more rubble than structure. The machine dispensed the cup with a mechanical sigh. That's when Pierce appeared behind her, his reflection materializing in the glass face of the vending machine like a ghost taking shape. He was close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and aggressively male, the olfactory equivalent of a peacock's tail. "You know, Katie," he said, and the false familiarity of her first name from his mouth tasted like pennies. "Security might need to escort you out if you keep practicing medicine without a license." His voice was conversational now, almost friendly, which somehow made it worse. "I've documented 3 instances this week alone." 3. She didn't turn around. Didn't acknowledge him with anything more than continued stillness. Her hand closed around the coffee cup. The warmth of it grounded her in her body, reminded her that she was here, present, and in control. "Just a heads up," Pierce continued, moving closer, from one professional to another. "I'm building a file. The kind that gets people fired." He waited for a response, a flinch, a denial, something he could work with. Katie simply withdrew her coffee from the slot, stood, and walked past him without making eye contact. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The kind of iron discipline that came from knowing that 1 second of visible reaction would compromise 14 months of field work, would tank a DOD operation, would get Colonel Webb reassigned to a facility where he'd die of an infection that should have been treatable. 60 seconds later, she was in the supply closet 3 corridors away, the fluorescent lights casting everything in shades of institutional white. Her hands found the metal shelf. She gripped it until her knuckles went white, her breath coming in short bursts that she forced through her nose, down into her diaphragm, the breathing technique they'd taught her in airborne school. Control the breath, control the body, control the outcome. Her fingers ached. Good. Pain was data. Pain meant she was still here, still functioning, still mission-capable. Through the door, muffled by industrial-grade steel, she heard Pierce in the hallway telling another nurse, "Keep an eye on Rodriguez. I'm building a file. She's a liability." Katie released the shelf and stepped back. Her hands were steady again. Her breathing had normalized. She was someone else now, the competent professional, the nurse with certifications and a clean record and a history that could withstand scrutiny. The other version of herself, the one with calluses on her hands and a Navy Cross gathering dust in a Pentagon vault, could wait. Captain Katie Rodriguez would have to wait. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 1800 hours when Katie pulled Colonel Webb's lab results and found something that made her blood go cold. His D-dimer levels, the test that detects blood clots, were critically elevated at 2,847 nanograms per milliliter, well above the threshold for acute thromboembolism. But instead of flagging urgent in the active results, the report had been archived, routed backward through the system like it had gone the wrong direction down a one-way street. Someone had deliberately hidden it. She pulled his file deeper, digging through the accumulated data of 8 months of treatment. 3 other results over the past week followed the same pattern, flagged, then unflagged, then buried in archived storage where no one reviewed daily reports would find them. All of them marked as reviewed by the same digital signature, Dr. James Pierce, attending physician, cardiovascular specialist. His terminal had accessed Webb's file 47 times in the past 14 days. The access patterns were wrong, not the normal pattern of a treating physician checking on his patient, but something systematic, repetitive, designed to look routine while extracting specific data points. At 2,100 hours, she was in the parking garage on the pretext of retrieving something from her locker. She positioned herself behind a concrete pillar with a sight line toward the elevator bank and waited. Patience was another thing they taught you in the military, the ability to stay motionless, to breathe shallow, to exist as quietly as a photograph. Pierce emerged at 21:04, and he wasn't alone. A woman in her late 40s, blonde, dressed in business casual that probably cost more than Katie's annual salary, walked beside him. They moved toward a Tesla, their body language suggesting familiarity that went beyond professional introduction. The woman's hand briefly touched his shoulder. They laughed about something. Katie raised her phone and photographed the woman's credentials badge, clipped to her blazer, Blackstone Medical Solutions, Strategic Partnership Division. The company name meant nothing to her immediately, but she'd check it later. She'd check everything later. Back in the ICU at 2,145 hours, Webb's oxygen saturation dropped to 89%. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, the sound of his lungs working against resistance. His lips were taking on a faint blue tint, cyanosis beginning at the edges, the color of inadequate oxygen perfusion. Katie increased his oxygen flow from 40% to 60%, documenting the adjustment in real time. Protocol technically required her to page the attending physician first. Protocol was a luxury she couldn't afford when a fellow operator's blood wasn't carrying enough oxygen to keep his brain functioning. She accessed his classified military medical file, the backdoor her Dodd handler had built into her cover identity, the kind of access that would get her court-martialed if it was ever documented officially. The file showed 8 months of incomplete treatment, delayed imaging studies, a litany of complaints from Webb himself requesting expedited evaluation for retained shrapnel fragments that were probably triggering an immune response nobody was treating. The timeline was unmistakable. Every delay, every misrouted test, every lost lab result coincided precisely with Dr. Pierce taking over his case. At midnight, she was in the hospital's medical records database, access she wasn't supposed to have, permissions that existed only in shadow code, cross-referencing every special operations patient admitted to Seattle General in the past 14 months. The pattern emerged like a photograph developing in chemical solution. 23 patients total. All of them Green Berets or SEALs. All of them treated by Pierce. All of them with medical data accessed by an unauthorized user. All digital fingerprints routed through Pierce's terminal, secure messaging apps, encrypted data transfers, file downloads marked research purposes and then immediately deleted from the hospital's backup servers. She'd found her leak. Dr. Pierce was selling soldier medical data to Blackstone Medical Solutions, a pharmaceutical company with documented ties to foreign investment groups, the kind of foreign investors who would pay extraordinary money for classified information about the health conditions, medications, and vulnerabilities of America's elite special operations personnel. What happened next changed everything. The labs were archived. That was the first thing Katie noticed at 1800 hours, when she pulled Webb's complete metabolic panel from the hospital system and found the D-dimer results buried 3 folders deep in what should have been purged data. D-dimer elevated at 2.8, which meant clotting cascade, which meant thromboembolism risk, which meant someone had seen this number and decided it needed to disappear. She printed the results with hands that didn't shake. Nurse Katie Rodriguez was careful. Captain Katie Rodriguez knew how to read a crime scene, and this was one written in lab values and falsified timestamps. The second set of labs, dated 4 days later, showed the D-dimer normalized. Corrected, the notation read: system error in previous batch. Nothing to see here. Except the handwriting on the correction authorization wasn't hospital tech, it was the precise, physician-level signature of Dr. Marcus Pierce, signed in blue ink at 2,247 hours, the kind of late-night authorization that nobody questioned because questioning it meant challenging hospital hierarchy, which meant ending your career. She sat in the break room at the back of the ICU, the fluorescent lights casting everything in that sickly overhead white that made people look like corpses. The space smelled like burnt coffee and the phantom trace of antiseptic that never fully washed out of the walls. 2 other nurses were charting at the computer station. Katie kept her face neutral as she traced Pierce's signature pattern across 6 different correction authorizations, 6 cases where elevated D-dimer results had been marked as clerical errors, all signed by Pierce, all occurring in the past 18 months, all involving special operations personnel admitted under classified medical agreements. 6 soldiers. 6 elevated clotting markers. 6 carefully erased trails. Webb's case was the most recent, and the most obvious. A green beret medevac from Helmand province with shrapnel fragmentation injuries, the kind of trauma that triggered coagulation cascade, the kind of condition that required aggressive anticoagulation therapy and constant lab monitoring. Instead, Webb's actual clotting status had been buried in archive data marked corrected. No physician would see the real numbers. No physician would order preventative treatment. The thromboembolism would develop silently, invisible, until it killed him. Katie's hands remained steady as she closed the hospital system and logged out. Muscle memory. Training. The kind of composure that came from having watched fellow medics die from mistakes she couldn't fix in Helmand province, where there were no archived labs and no correction authorizations, just the finality of a body bag and a flag folded into a triangle. She walked to Webb's room on the 4th floor ICU pod, the corridor fluorescent and humming with the white noise of ventilators and cardiac monitors, and found him awake, reading something on a tablet, a tactical novel, judging by the cover art. He glanced up when she entered, and something in his face shifted. Recognition. He knew her, even after all these months of careful distance, even with her civilian clothes and her deferential posture in the presence of attending physicians. Your vitals, Katie said, her voice the careful, professional tone of a nurse documenting routine care. She moved to the monitor, checking the display with the deliberation of someone doing her job. Heart rate 88. Blood pressure 132/78. O2 saturation 96% on room air. All normal. All the visible numbers told the right story. The invisible numbers were screaming. Everything okay? Webb asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. Routine assessment, Katie replied, maintaining the mask. She finished the vitals and stepped back from the bed, her posture already shifting toward the door. But her eyes held something else, something that said, I see the pattern. I see what's being done to you. I'm not leaving. What happened next didn't happen immediately, but Katie could feel it in the air pressure change, the way her body recognized danger the same way it had recognized the sound of incoming mortar fire in Jalabad. Pierce was moving, escalating, preparing something. The correction authorizations weren't random, they were a pattern, a strategy, a surgical plan designed to eliminate a problem. And that problem was a Green Beret who knew things. A soldier who had access to classified information about foreign intelligence operations. A man whose medical vulnerability could be exploited if nobody was watching, if his lab values stayed hidden, if a thromboembolism developed slowly enough that by the time someone noticed, it would look like natural complications from his original injury. She checked the hospital system again at 2,100 hours, from her personal laptop in her apartment in the Ballard district of Seattle, 22 minutes from the hospital. Pierce had ordered new labs for Webb. Routine coagulation panel. Standard protocol for a trauma patient. The results wouldn't come back until morning, which meant the analysis would show whatever analysis Pierce had prepared for them to show. Another buried D-dimer. Another correction authorization. Another soldier sliding toward death on a bed in ICU for while the physicians looked at falsified data and did nothing. Katie opened a secure encrypted channel that connected to a Pentagon server, the kind of communication line that didn't appear on any hospital network. She typed for words, Webb's lab results falsified. Then she waited, knowing that somewhere in a classified office in Washington, D.C., a handler was reading her message and understanding that the operation had escalated beyond simple intelligence gathering. This was sabotage. This was deliberate harm to an asset, a soldier, by someone embedded inside the hospital system. The response came in 90 seconds, do not intervene. Maintain cover. Evidence collection priority 1. Katie stared at the screen. Evidence collection. Document the crime. Build the case. Let the system work. Except the system was already dead, buried under false lab results and correction authorization signed by a physician who was selling soldier medical data like it was spare inventory. The system couldn't work because the system was designed by the people poisoning it. She closed the encrypted channel and prepared for what was coming. Because something was coming, she could feel it the way she'd felt the pressure shift before an ambush in Helmand Province, the way her body recognized the particular texture of imminent disaster. Webb's artificially falsified lab results would mean he wouldn't receive anticoagulation therapy. The elevated D-dimer would be invisible. The clotting cascade would begin, slow and silent, at the molecular level where nobody was watching because nobody was allowed to see the truth. She set her alarm for 0130 hours and lay in the dark of her apartment, listening to the rain hammer the windows of her temporary civilian life. 24 hours from now, Captain Katie Rodriguez would make a decision. She could wait for the Pentagon's investigation to unfold on its schedule, document the evidence in her careful undercover role, let the bureaucracy move at its glacial pace while a fellow soldier died in a hospital bed. Or she could step out from behind the mask and do what she'd trained to do, what her muscle memory knew how to do, what the tactical training of 18 years told her was the only rational response to a patient in mortal danger and a system designed to kill him. Nurse Katie Rodriguez would wait. Captain Katie Rodriguez already knew what 01 for 5 hours would bring. She'd already made her choice. At 02 for 5 hours, she was still awake, staring at the dark ceiling, her hands flat against the bedsheets with the same precision that would be required in exactly 2 hours. Her phone sat silent on the nightstand, no alerts from the hospital, no emergency notifications. Webb's monitors weren't alarming. Not yet. The thromboembolism hadn't formed yet. The clinical cascade hadn't begun yet. But Katie knew. She could feel the shape of it in the falsified data, the pattern of it in Pierce's carefully constructed corrections, the inevitability of it in the deliberate erasure of the one warning sign that might have saved his life. At 01 for 5 hours, alarms would scream. At 01 for 5 hours, everything would change. At 01 for 5 hours, Nurse Katie Rodriguez would either maintain her cover or lose everything trying to save a man she'd once called captain. She closed her eyes and counted her breathing, 4 counts in, hold for 4 counts out, the tactical respiration pattern that kept heart rate low and thinking clear when everything else was demanding panic. In the darkness of her apartment, her hands remembered the shape of scalpels and the exact location of the intercostal spaces. Her training was patient. Her cover was nearly flawless. Her patient was running out of time. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. The alarm shrieked at 01 for 5 hours, a sound like a banshee cutting through the ICU synthetic quiet. Katie's eyes snapped open from the chair beside Colonel Webb's bed, her hand already moving before her conscious mind registered the rhythm strip flatline climbing across the monitor. For seconds. That was how long it took her to cross from the vinyl chair to his bedside, her muscle memory moving faster than any civilian nurse protocol could have dictated. The code was happening in slow motion and fast forward simultaneously, that strange temporal warping that only happens when your autonomic nervous system recognizes a life event. Webb's chest had seized mid-breath, his lungs collapsing inward. Massive pulmonary embolism, the blood clot they'd all missed because Dr. Pierce had buried the D-dimer levels 3 folders deep in archived storage, had written normal limits on a report that screamed danger in numbers too loud to ignore. 52. That was her patient's oxygen saturation now, and dropping. The monitor beeped its mechanical death song, each pulse slower than the last. Katie's hand moved toward the crash cart without hesitation, without the slightest tremor. The crash cart lived 3 feet away from every critical patient in the ICU, a metal coffin filled with options that ranged from last resort to final goodbye. She grabbed the trauma shears first, wrong tool, reflex, muscle memory from a different lifetime, then pivoted to the scalpel tray. The handle felt like coming home. Cold stainless steel, familiar weight, the kind of weight that had saved lives in mud brick compounds when the only OR was a generator and 3 flashlights duct taped to a stretcher. The incision would be lateral anterolateral thoracotomy, 4th intercostal space, between ribs 4 and 5. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of apex predators, no hesitation, no second guessing, just the absolute certainty of someone who had done this 11 consecutive times while mortars were screaming overhead and the only anesthesia was the knowledge that hesitation meant death. The scalpel parted Webb's chest with a sound like fabric tearing, clean and decisive. Blood welled immediately, that copper smell flooding the air, primal and electric. Katie's fingers found the pericardium and made the incision through the membrane, then her hand was inside his chest, her fingers closing around his heart. The muscle felt like cold meat, unresponsive, a thing that had forgotten how to live. She began the manual massage, her palm against his left ventricle, squeezing with a rhythm that was part CPR, part prayer, part the muscle memory of hands that had held together too many catastrophic bleeds in the dark. Squeeze. Release. Squeeze. The blood continued flowing but his heart wouldn't remember how to beat on its own. Epi. Now, she said, her voice dropped an octave below the deferential nurse whisper she'd cultivated for 6 months. This voice came from somewhere deeper, somewhere that had been trained in command infrastructure before hospitals or civilian protocols existed. 1 milligram for push. A resident she didn't recognize froze beside the medication drawer, hands trembling as he reached for the epinephrine vial. Another nurse, Chen, Katie thought, the night shift RN who actually knew how to work, was already moving, drawing up the drug with practiced efficiency. The hiss of the syringe needle piercing the medication port. 60 milligrams of adrenaline into Webb's bloodstream, delivered directly to his heart where Katie's fingers kept working their mechanical resurrection. Squeeze. Release. Squeeze. The monitor maintained its flat line, that constant, accusatory sound like a car alarm no one would turn off. Katie's other hand reached out without looking, and Chen placed a second 14-gauge angiocath needle into her waiting palm. Katie didn't break rhythm with the chest compressions, just extended her left hand, and Chen threaded the needle into Webb's groin, a femoral line that would deliver blood products directly to his core if his own circulation decided to cooperate. The door to the ICU bay slammed open hard enough to rattle the ventilator. Dr. Pierce's face appeared first, his eyes taking in the scene with the slow motion of someone watching a train crash in real time, Katie elbow deep in his patient's thoracic cavity, her hands moving with the precision of an experienced surgeon, the incision textbook perfect and absolutely catastrophic from a hospital policy perspective. His face went purple, not with concern, but with rage. With the fury of a man watching his authority being systematically dismantled by a nurse he'd been planning to destroy with a phone call. Pierce's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. His hand was already reaching into his jacket pocket, already fishing for his phone, already composing the incident report in his mind. Gross negligence. Practicing medicine without a license. Unauthorized surgical procedure. All violations that would be on Katie's termination paperwork before Webb's heart ever beat on its own again. If it ever beat on its own again. One more epi, Katie said to Chen, her voice steady as a surgical laser. Not a request. An order. The kind of voice that moved people without question, the kind of authority that came from knowing exactly how many people had bled out while someone debated the proper protocol for authorization. The second epinephrine push went in. Katie's fingers continued their rhythm, and the world narrowed to nothing but the feel of Webb's heart under her palm, the monitor's flat line, the fluorescent lights humming their electric hymn overhead. 20 compressions. 30. 40. Time became a meaningless concept. It could have been 3 minutes or 3 hours. Then, a flutter. A single beat that registered on the monitor like a ghost, an echo of what a heartbeat might sound like. Katie's hands kept moving. The next beat came stronger. Then another. Then the monitor registered sinus rhythm, that beautiful, terrible electrical signature of a heart remembering it was supposed to keep the body alive. Webb's oxygen saturation climbed, 55%, 62, 68, 71. The pulse oximeter's beeping accelerated into a rhythm that suggested survival might be possible. His blood pressure registered on the monitor, 76/43. Not good. Not stable. But alive. Present. In the game. Katie didn't remove her hand from Webb's chest. She stood there, fingers still positioned against his heart as if she might need to start the whole resurrection ritual again if his body decided to quit. Blood had soaked through her scrubs, warm and sticky, the smell of it filling the ICU bay like evidence and indictment both. Pierce was still standing in the doorway, his face a masterpiece of impotent rage. "Get me sutures," Katie said to Chen. "I need to close this before infection turns into a bigger problem than the embolism." The next 6 hours was muscle memory and protocol. Katie worked methodically, closing the pericardium, approximating the ribs, then the intercostal muscles, then the fascia, then the skin. The sutures were precise, almost beautiful in their execution, the kind of surgical closure that suggested formal training in conditions where precision meant the difference between a soldier walking home or going home in a flag-draped box. By the time she'd finished, Webb's oxygen saturation had climbed to 87%, and his vitals had stabilized enough that he might actually survive the next 48 hours. Pierce appeared at noon with a security officer and HR Director Mitchell, a woman whose job was apparently to deliver bad news in the most bureaucratic manner possible. Katie was still at Webb's bedside, adjusting his flow rate, double-checking his medication drip, doing all the small invisible work that kept critical patients breathing. "Captain Rodriguez," Pierce began, then caught himself, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Excuse me, Nurse Rodriguez. You are hereby suspended pending investigation. This is an official notice." Katie didn't look up from Webb's monitor. Her jaw clenched once, briefly, a micro-expression that was the only violence her body allowed itself to show. She continued documenting Webb's status in the chart, her handwriting steady and unflinching, each notation a testament to composure under conditions designed to break it. The termination notice came at 0600 the next morning. 16 violations. Practicing medicine without a license. Gross negligence. Falsification of credentials. Each charge meticulously documented with citations and witness statements, the paperwork so precisely constructed that it was less an accusation than a bureaucratic execution. Pierce had turned her heroism into a crime, reframed her medical knowledge as fraud, and done it all with the precision of someone who'd had plenty of practice dismantling people through proper channels. "You have 30 minutes to clear your locker," Pierce said, unable to hide his satisfaction. "Security will escort you out." Katie stayed for 18 more hours anyway. She stayed until the night shift nurse arrived and Katie could personally brief the handoff, all the details about Webb's medications, his output, his respiratory status, everything the next shift needed to keep him alive. She stayed while Pierce documented her presence as trespassing and insubordination. She stayed because the only thing that mattered in that moment was making sure the man she'd trained alongside in Helmand Province had a fighting chance at a future. When she finally left at 0800, the cardboard box felt heavier than any equipment she'd ever carried. The cracked Navy coffee mug, a gift from her drill sergeant father, dead 5 years now, dead believing his daughter was just a nurse. The half-dead succulent from her desk that nobody had watered in 6 months. The photo of her father in dress blues, his hands on her shoulders, his pride visible in every line of his face. He'd never known about the silver star locked in a Pentagon file. He'd never known about the patrol that had gone wrong, about the field thoracotomy that had saved a Marine who would have bled out in the dust otherwise. He'd only known that his daughter was being a nurse, and he'd been so proud. The rain started as Katie reached the bus stop on Cherry Street. It hammered down like applause from an empty stadium, soaking through her scrubs, running down her face in rivulets that might have been tears if she'd been the type of woman to cry anymore. Her cover was blown. Her mission was compromised. Pierce was still selling classified medical data to foreign investors while she stood unemployed on a street corner in Norfolk with everything she owned in a cardboard box that was slowly falling apart from moisture. But that wasn't the worst part. The rain hammered the parking lot like applause as Katie stood at the bus stop on Cherry Street, a cardboard box balanced against her hip. Inside, a cracked Navy coffee mug, a half-dead succulent she'd kept alive through 3 deployments, and a photograph of her drill sergeant father in his service dress blues. The photo was the only thing that mattered. He died believing she was just a nurse. He never knew what she'd really become. The bus didn't come for 17 minutes. She counted every one of them, standing motionless in weather that would have sent most people scrambling for shelter. But Katie Rodriguez had endured worse than rain. The box began to soften from moisture. She shifted it slightly but didn't move to the shelter of the awning. Standing in the open meant less thinking about what came next: civilian life, apartment hunting, a job at Norfolk Community College teaching basic life support to people who didn't care. That wasn't the worst part. 3 days later, a patient arrived in Webb's ICU pod under armed guard. A Taliban commander, classified diplomatic agreement, the kind of prisoner patient that meant federal marshals stayed within 10 feet at all times. Katie was checking the 4-line at the neighboring bed when the man's eyes went wide. His whisper cut through the quiet room like a scalpel: Artemis. The Angel of Helmand. The monitors kept their steady rhythm. Nobody else heard him. But Katie froze for exactly 2 seconds, the only sign that the name meant anything. The commander's voice dropped further, words meant only for her: you came back for the wounded. Every time. Even when the fire came down. Katie didn't acknowledge him. She finished the line check and moved to the next bed. But something had shifted. The truth had a scent now, metallic and dangerous, and it was bleeding into the hospital air. That's when the Marine Corps liaison stepped forward. His uniform was dress blues, pressed sharp enough to cut, and the papers in his hand carried the weight of official recognition. His voice was formal, the kind of precise military cadence that made every staff member in the ICU stop moving. Captain Katie Rodriguez. Navy Cross recipient for actions in Helmand Province, where she performed 11 consecutive field surgeries under direct enemy fire, saving the lives of 43 personnel. He paused. The numbers hung in the air like bullets suspended mid-flight. Saving 43 personnel. The citation is being declassified effective immediately. Dr. Pierce shouldered through the gathering crowd, his voice pitched high and sharp as breaking glass. That's impossible. Stolen Valor. Falsified credentials. Security, I want this woman, but he stopped. His words died like a flatline monitor going silent. A 2-star general stepped off the elevator. Her uniform carried more ribbons than most officers saw in a lifetime. She looked at Katie with the kind of recognition that crosses all distance, all hierarchy, all pretense. Then the general rendered a sharp salute, a fist pressed to her chest, held there for 1 full second. A salute of honor. A salute to a legend. Katie returned the salute with the same precision. The silver star and purple heart that existed only in locked Pentagon files suddenly existed here, in the room, in the eyes of everyone watching. The general's voice was quiet but absolute. "Captain Rodriguez, you've completed your assignment." Webb's eyes went wider than the commander's had been. He understood what that meant. All of it. The termination paperwork, the humiliation, the 24-hour vigil at his bedside while she was supposedly just a nurse who'd violated protocol. It was all part of something larger. Something designed. And then the FBI arrived. Special Agent Torres moved through the ICU like someone who'd already won the battle before the first shot fired. Her credentials appeared before her voice did. "We need to speak with Dr. Marcus Pierce regarding unauthorized access to classified medical records." Pierce's phone was in his hand. His thumbs flew across the screen, frantic, desperate, someone deleting evidence while the noose was still loose around his neck. "This is harassment. I'm calling my attorney." Torres didn't raise her voice. She never had to. "Dr. Pierce, you've accessed the medical records of 43 Special Operations personnel over 14 months, selling comprehensive data to Blackstone Medical Solutions, a pharmaceutical company with documented foreign intelligence ties." The air pressure in the ICU changed. It felt like standing in a room where the oxygen was slowly being removed. "You falsified Captain Rodriguez's termination paperwork. The moment you filed those documents, they triggered automatic federal review of all personnel actions you've authorized. We found the pattern. Every nurse, every physician who questioned your treatment of military patients was systematically removed. Fabricated documentation. Over a year of it." Pierce's face cycled through colors like a medical monitor tracking a failing heart. Purple. White. Gray. A resident who'd witnessed the vending machine mockery, who'd laughed at the Nightingale's reject comments, stepped forward with the kind of guilt-driven courage that comes too late. "He told me Rodriguez was dangerous. He said she was unstable. That she'd lied about her credentials. He made all of us believe." Torres took the phone from Pierce's shaking hands. The gesture was casual, inevitable. "Dr. Marcus Pierce, you're under arrest for espionage, falsification of federal records, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud." The handcuffs locked around his wrists with a sound like finality closing a door. Click. Click. The sound echoed through the ICU like it was traveling down a long hallway inside his chest. Pierce looked at Katie. His expression shifted from rage to desperation, the face of someone who'd suddenly understood that every move he'd made had been anticipated, documented, used. "You don't understand. They offered me funding for research. I didn't know what would." Katie's voice stopped him mid-sentence. Flat. Authoritative. The voice of someone who'd seen what intelligence like his could cost in blood. 3 of those operators were killed in targeted attacks based on medical weaknesses you disclosed. You didn't just break protocol, Dr. Pierce. You're a traitor. Security footage played across Torres's tablet, Pierce meeting with Blackstone representatives in a hotel conference room, accepting payments in manila envelopes, downloading encrypted files onto a secured drive. The perp walk through Seattle General's lobby was witnessed by every staff member who'd heard the mockery, who'd believed the carefully constructed lies, who'd laughed. They watched him move between the federal agents like a man sleepwalking into consequences he'd never thought would actually arrive. Katie watched from the 4th-floor window as they loaded him into the vehicle. The rain had stopped, but the asphalt was still wet, still reflective, still catching the light like something wounded. Webb's voice came from behind her, weak but clear, words dragged up from a place deep inside his chest. You trained me at Pendleton. Right before you disappeared. I thought you'd been killed. Katie turned slowly. Webb was propped up on pillows, his breathing still compromised from the pulmonary embolism that should have killed him, but the light in his eyes was sharp now, calculating, understanding. I got new orders. To babysit me. Webb's laugh turned into a cough, but there was no bitterness in it, only the rough humor of someone who'd finally seen the full picture. To catch the leak that was getting operators killed. You were patient 0, first special operations admission after Pierce started selling data. They needed someone inside who could recognize the pattern. Webb touched the faded unit patch sewn inside his jacket lining, the same patch Katie had given him at Pendleton before she disappeared into this new mission. "You said I'd need this more than you." "I never understood why." "Because someone had to stop the bleeding," Katie said. "And it couldn't be done in uniform." 18 months later, Katie sat at her new desk at Naval Special Warfare Command in Norfolk, the city where her father had taught her that service means sacrifice in ways civilians never quite understand. The faded unit patch was pinned above her computer. Webb had mailed it back with a photograph from Kabul. He was in the center of a class of medics, all of them alive, all of them trained, all of them carrying forward the knowledge that had cost so much. Scrawled on the back of the photo, "Teaching CPR at Norfolk Community College isn't quite the same as cardiac surgery, is it, Pierce?" She'd heard through federal channels that Pierce's plea deal included permanent revocation of his medical license, 5 years in a federal facility, and upon release, court-mandated community service teaching basic life support at minimum wage. The irony was sharp enough to draw blood. The man who weaponized hierarchy and credentials now reduced to teaching the most fundamental skill to indifferent students who'd never know how dangerous ignorance could become. Captain Rodriguez's office overlooked the SEAL training compound where the next generation ran the same obstacles she'd conquered 15 years ago. Her official title was Medical Operations Liaison. Her real job continued, finding leaks, protecting operators, doing work that didn't come with public recognition or medals pinned to dress uniforms. The Navy Cross and Silver Star remained in locked Pentagon files where they belonged. Operational security meant some victories had to stay classified. The nursing credentials stayed active too. She maintained them herself, kept up with continuing education, because the best cover is one you never truly abandon. A knock at her door. A young ensign entered, fresh from medical training, eyes wide with the kind of enthusiasm that came from not yet knowing what war cost. "There's a situation at Walter Reed. Classified patient, inconsistent treatment, possible security breach. They're requesting someone with experience in." He trailed off, uncertain how to phrase it. "Someone who can operate in both worlds," Katie finished. She picked up her go bag, always packed, always ready. The photograph of her father was tucked in the front pocket now, but she'd added something else, Webb with his new class of medics in Kabul, all of them alive because someone stayed 24 hours when everyone else walked away. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. Katie closed her office door and headed for the next mission, where the real battle continued in places most people would never see, fought by people most people would never know, for operators who'd learn her name only after she'd already completed the assignment and disappeared again into whatever shadow the Pentagon needed filled. The work wasn't done. It would never be done. But it was hers now, and that was enough. Subscribe for more stories of quiet heroism. Like and comment if you'd have made the same choice Katie did.